Most people don't struggle with paperwork because they're disorganized. The real reason it feels so difficult is much quieter than that. It's because every single piece of paper feels like a decision you can't afford to get wrong. And when that builds up over 20, 30, even 40 years, it stops feeling like something you can just sit down and handle in an afternoon. It becomes something you keep putting off, not because you're avoiding it, but because you don't want to make a mistake that comes back to cause problems later. You look at a stack of papers and think to yourself, there could be something important in here. Maybe it's an old tax return. Maybe it's an insurance document. Maybe it's something tied to a medical visit from years ago. You're not completely sure, but that uncertainty is enough to make you leave it where it is. So you set it aside. Then more papers come in. A new statement, a receipt, something from the mail that feels important enough to keep, but not urgent enough to deal with right away. And slowly, without really noticing it happening, one small pile turns into a drawer, then a box, then a few different places where things are stored just in case. And this is the part most people don't talk about. The weight you feel isn't really coming from the paper itself. It's coming from what those papers represent. Because this isn't just clutter in the usual sense. These are pieces of your life. Tax returns from years you worked hard, insurance papers tied to decisions you made to protect yourself or your family, medical records connected to moments you had to pay attention to your health, letters, warranties, documents that once had a clear purpose and in some cases still might. And when everything feels even slightly important, it becomes very difficult to let anything go without hesitation. So instead of dealing with it, you start to live around it. You tell yourself you'll get to it when you have more time, or when you feel more focused, or when you're in the right mindset to finally sit down and sort through everything properly. But that moment rarely arrives the way you expect it to. And this is where most people quietly get stuck, sometimes for years, not because they don't care and not because they're incapable, but because the process feels too risky. Throwing away the wrong thing feels like a mistake you can't undo. So the safest option becomes leaving everything exactly where it is. If that's where you are right now, there's nothing unusual about it. In fact, it's one of the most common situations people find themselves in when paperwork has been building up over a long period of time. But this is also where things can begin to change, and not in the way most people expect. Because this isn't about sitting down and trying to go through every single paper while making the perfect decision each time. That approach is exactly what creates the overwhelm in the first place. And it's definitely not about clearing everything out in one day, because that usually leads to frustration and burnout, and then everything goes back to where it was. What actually makes this process work is much simpler and much more realistic. Instead of trying to handle everything at once, you reduce the number of decisions you have to make. Right now, every paper feels like its own separate problem, and that's what makes the whole thing exhausting. But when you simplify the way you decide, the experience starts to feel completely different. Now, just to be clear, this doesn't suddenly make everything easy. You're still going to come across papers that make you pause. There will still be moments where you're unsure, and that's perfectly normal. But what changes is this. Instead of sitting there feeling stuck every time you try to start, you begin to move. And once you can move, even slowly, the process becomes something you can actually work through over time. So instead of overthinking each individual paper, you're going to rely on one simple filter. If a document does not serve your present life, protect your future, or hold real meaning, it doesn't need to stay. And that's the foundation. And this is where things begin to shift in a very practical way. Because instead of asking yourself a different question for every single piece of paper, you're asking the same question every time. And that consistency removes a huge amount of pressure. You're no longer trying to figure everything out from scratch. You're simply deciding what stays and what doesn't based on something clear and repeatable. And that's what finally makes it possible to begin without feeling overwhelmed. Now, this is where things start to become practical, because once you have a simple way to decide, the next question naturally becomes, what do you actually do with each piece of paper when you pick it up? And this is exactly where most people get stuck again. Not because they don't understand the idea, but because they try to make the system more complicated than it needs to be. They start thinking about folders, labels, categories, subcategories, and before long, they're right back in that same place of hesitation, trying to figure out where something should go instead of simply moving forward. So instead of adding more decisions, we're going to remove them. Every paper you pick up is only going to go into one of 4 places. That's it. Not 10 categories, not a detailed filing system, just 4 clear destinations that cover almost everything you're going to come across. And once you understand these, you'll notice something almost immediately. You stop pausing as much because most papers start to feel familiar and you already know where they belong before you even finish looking at them. The first category is what you might think of as keep forever. These are the documents that genuinely matter long term. The ones tied to your identity, your legal standing, or anything that would be difficult to replace if it were gone. For most people, this includes things like birth certificates, property records, social security information, major legal agreements, or anything connected to ownership and proof of identity. When you come across something like this, there's usually a level of clarity that comes with it. You don't sit there wondering what to do. You recognize it and you set it aside without hesitation. And here's something that surprises a lot of people when they actually go through this process. This category is usually much smaller than they expected, which matters because it helps you see that not everything deserves to be treated as equally important. Now, the second category is what we'll call keep for now. These are papers that still have a role in your current life, but they don't need to be kept forever. And this is where a lot of everyday paperwork falls. Things like recent tax returns, insurance policies that are still active, medical records you may need to refer back to, utility bills, bank statements, or anything tied to something that's still ongoing. The mistake people often make here is either treating these like permanent documents or mixing them in with everything else so they're hard to find later. Instead, you're just giving them a simple, accessible place. Not over-organized, not perfect, just easy to locate when you actually need them. And this is where things usually start to feel a little lighter because you're separating what's truly permanent from what's just temporarily relevant. Now, the third category is where a lot of people experience real relief, and this is what we call digitize and release. These are the papers that still hold meaning or information you might want to keep, but don't need to exist physically in your space anymore. This might be a stack of old letters you've kept over the years, photos that were printed long before everything went digital, or even records from years ago that you don't need physically but feel uncomfortable throwing away. And this is where you give yourself another option. Instead of choosing between keeping it or losing it completely, you simply capture it. Take a photo with your phone, scan it if you prefer, and keep a digital copy that you can access anytime. That way, you're not losing the memory or the information. You're just choosing not to carry it physically anymore. And for a lot of people, this is the point where the pressure starts to ease because you're no longer forced into an all or nothing decision. Now, the last category is the one that usually brings up the most hesitation, and that's let go. These are the papers that no longer serve your present life, don't protect your future, and don't hold meaningful value. Old statements from years ago that you've never gone back to, expired policies, duplicate copies of things you already have, paperwork tied to situations that are long resolved. At first, placing something in this category can feel uncomfortable because there's always that small voice that says, "What if?" And this is where it helps to be realistic. Letting go doesn't mean you'll never question a decision again. You might occasionally wonder about something you threw away. That's normal. But what you'll also notice over time is that most of the things you let go of never come up again. And this is where things begin to shift. Because instead of feeling like you're losing something, you start to see that you're creating space, both physically and mentally. Now you might be sitting there thinking, this makes sense, but my situation feels bigger than this. Maybe you have multiple boxes. Maybe paperwork has been building up for decades. Maybe it's spread across different rooms. And that's completely valid. This system isn't designed to solve everything in one day. It works gradually. What it gives you is a way to sit down, pick up a piece of paper, and know what to do with it without getting stuck in your head every single time. And this is where most people begin to notice a real difference. Not because everything is suddenly organized, but because they're no longer freezing at the starting point. Now, this is also where things tend to slow down if you're not careful. You pick up one paper, and instead of placing it, you start thinking through every possible outcome. You try to make the perfect decision, and before you know it, you've spent several minutes on something that should have taken seconds. So here's something that will help more than you might expect. In most cases, your first instinct is already good enough. You've lived with your paperwork for years. You know what matters. You know what doesn't. Well, the longer you sit with a decision, the heavier it feels. So instead of aiming for perfect decisions, aim for clear ones that keep you moving. And this is where things quietly begin to change. Because once you stop treating every paper like a high-stakes decision, the process starts to feel manageable in a way it didn't before. And that's what allows you to keep going. Now, this is the part that actually determines whether any of this makes a difference in your day-to-day life. Because understanding what to do is one thing, but being able to sit down and begin, especially after putting it off for a long time, is something else entirely. What tends to happen for most people is that they wait for the right moment, the kind of day where they feel they have enough time, enough energy, and enough mental clarity to go through everything properly. And while that sounds reasonable, it rarely works out that way in real life. The day either never comes, or when it does, the task feels bigger than expected, and it becomes something that gets pushed aside once again. So instead of waiting for that kind of moment, it helps to approach this in a way that fits into the kind of days you actually have, not the ones you wish you had. That means starting smaller than you think you should, but doing it in a way that still feels meaningful. You might open a drawer that you've been avoiding for a while, or take a single folder and sit down with it at the table, or even gather a small stack of papers that has been sitting in the same place for weeks without being touched. The key is not how much you start with, but that you choose something you can realistically finish without feeling pressure building up halfway through. Because what makes the biggest difference at the beginning is not motivation, but evidence. Once you see yourself go through a small set of papers and reach the end of it without feeling overwhelmed, something shifts in the way your mind approaches the rest of the process. And this is usually the point where things begin to feel different, because the task no longer feels like one large, undefined problem, but something that can be handled in parts, one section at a time. As you continue, it helps to settle into a rhythm that doesn't leave you drained. And this is where many people make a quiet but important mistake, because they keep going until they are tired, thinking that pushing a little further will help them get more done. In reality, that approach often makes it harder to come back the next time. A better approach is to stop while you still feel in control, at a point where you could keep going if you wanted to, but choose not to. That way, when you return to it later, you are not carrying the weight of exhaustion or frustration from the previous session. Even a short amount of time, something like 15 or 20 minutes, is enough to create steady progress when it is repeated over several days. And over time, those small sessions add up in a way that feels far more manageable than trying to do everything at once. At some point during this process, a familiar concern is going to come up again, and it usually sounds something like this. What if I need this later? That question tends to carry more weight than it seems, because it is often the reason things have been kept for so long in the first place. Instead of trying to dismiss that concern, it helps to look at it more clearly. The documents that you truly need, the ones tied to your identity, your finances, or your legal responsibilities, are usually easy to recognize, and they tend to appear more than once in your life, which makes them difficult to overlook. The rest often feels important in the moment, but does not actually come up again in any meaningful way. And for the papers that sit in that uncertain space, where you are not completely sure, but don't feel comfortable letting go, there is a middle option that allows you to move forward without feeling like you are taking a risk. You can take a photo, scan the document, or keep a simple digital copy, which means you are keeping the information without holding on to the physical paper. For many people, that one adjustment is enough to reduce the hesitation that would otherwise slow everything down. As you continue this over time, the changes are not dramatic, but they are noticeable in ways that matter. You spend less time looking for things, you feel less tension when you come across a stack of papers, and there is less of that quiet mental weight sitting in the background of your day. What replaces it is a sense of control that builds gradually, not because everything is perfectly organized, but because nothing feels completely out of hand anymore. And that, more than anything, is what this process is really about. It is not about creating a perfect system or finishing everything as quickly as possible, but about creating a level of clarity that makes your space easier to live in and your decisions easier to make. It also has a quiet impact beyond your own day-to-day life, because at some point someone else may need to step in and understand what matters and what does not, whether that is a family member or someone helping you during a difficult time. And what you are doing now makes that process far simpler for them. So if this still feels like a lot, it helps to come back to something very simple and very realistic. You do not need to finish everything. You do not need to get it perfect. You only need to begin and to continue in a way that feels manageable. One drawer, one folder, one small group of papers at a time. Repeated consistently is enough to create meaningful change. And if you are willing to take a small step today, even something as simple as choosing one place to start, that is already enough to shift things in the right direction. If this approach made the process feel a little clearer or more manageable for you, you can let me know in the comments what area you are thinking of starting with, because sharing that not only helps you commit to it, but also helps others see that they are not alone in dealing with the same situation. If you know someone who has been quietly putting this off for a long time, whether it is a parent, a friend, or someone close to you, you can share this with them, because sometimes the hardest part is not the task itself, but hearing it explained in a way that feels realistic. And if you would like more guidance like this, you can subscribe so that the next time you are ready to take another step, you have something to come back to that continues to make this process feel simple and manageable. You can also like the video, because that small action helps it reach more people who are dealing with the same situation but have not yet found a way to approach it. And if you see the option to hype the video, which is a newer feature on YouTube, it is simply a way to give the video an extra push so it reaches more people who might benefit from it, especially those who are in the same position but have not come across this kind of guidance yet. Take your time with this, start where you can, and allow the process to unfold at a pace that feels right for you.